This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. This episode is sponsored by C-School, the online school for creativity training. If you'd like to unleash your creative potential and access a free Creativity Blueprint training series, then just head over to c.school. That's www.c.school for your free training series. In this episode, I speak with Ron Carucci, and we talk about the discipline of strategy, using artificial intelligence for book writing, and the 4 things great leaders know and do. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor. I'm delighted today to be joined by Ron Carucci. Ron Carucci is co-founder and managing partner at Navalent, working with CEOs and executives pursuing transformational change for their organizations, leaders, and industries. He has a 30-year track record helping some of the world's most influential executives tackle challenges of strategy, organization, and leadership. From startups to Fortune 10s, turnarounds to new markets and strategies, overhauling leadership and culture to redesigning for growth, he has worked in more than 25 countries on 4 continents. He is the best-selling author of 8 books, including the recent Amazon #1, Rising to Power. He is a regular contributor to HBR and Forbes and has been featured in Fortune, CEO Magazine, Business Insider, MSNBC, Business Week, Smart Business, and Thought Leaders everywhere know his name. So welcome, Ron, to coming on to the show.
Hey, James. Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
So share with us. I mean, you've got this book that's recently come out as well, and this is your 8th book. Does it get any easier after you by the time you get to your 8th book?
It's such a fun question. I actually think it gets harder. I think your expectations go up about the process. If anybody, I don't make my living as an author. My writing is primarily as a support system to my consulting work. It's sort of how I go learn about the problems my clients are facing, so I have something a little bit to offer. And I actually think the process between your research work, your writing work, and the whole commercialization work of the book, one of those is bound to give you a huge pain in the butt. And it just seems like every time I decide to take on another project, I have this fantasy that somehow all 3 of those will go relatively unscathed, and that never seems to be the case.
I guess the other benefit there is that some of my friends who are more from the academic world, and they'll do their research and they'll put the book out there, and sometimes it's success, sometimes it isn't. But the thing that they often challenge, because they're not necessarily working day in, day out with businesses, they maybe come from the more academic side. It can sometimes be a bit of a challenge making sure that you're hitting the mark, and the message that you have and the research you have is really what is in the minds of those executives and CEOs. So that, I suppose, being a consultant, that must give you some benefits because you're right in the trenches there.
And that was, the Rising to Power was expressly designed to solve an issue our clients were facing, and in a pretty pandemic way, the failure of executives on their way up to senior roles was out of control. And so I literally had pictures of my clients posted on the walls in my office when I wrote to literally keep them in mind at all times. And so I think the reason the book has done so well is because everybody who has read it has said, "Oh my gosh, this is happening to me right now. This is I just came out of a meeting yesterday where this happened, or I was about to go make that dumb mistake tomorrow." So we were able to fill it. We had 2,700 interview data points, so we had chock full, rich, insightful, inspiring, and painful stories and analytics with which to tell the story. So we were very advantaged and very fortunate to have such a wealth of over a 10-year period of a picture of what's happening to leaders and organizations as they assume broader responsibility, and why it is the failure rate has remained so high.
So how did you get into this world of consulting and the kind of work you do now? Where did it all begin for you?
Oh, gosh, about 175 years ago, it feels like. So my first career was in the arts. I spent my time in the performing world since I was 10, and that's what I studied early in college. And all of my friends would be envious of these great jobs I was getting in New York. And all I could think of in my head was, I have to do the same thing 8 times a week for how long? And I knew that I began to realize I bored easily. And so I tried to switch different mediums of art. But I was a young professional, and I lived in Germany for 3 years, working with the company that I worked for had contracts with the State Department, the U.S. military, to work across cultural lines with East Germans and West Germans. This is right before the Iron Curtain fell, so a while ago. We were doing a program at Dachau in the chapel. So the irony is not lost on me, even as a 20-something, that this is a pretty sacred place. Mm-hmm. And the word diversity and inclusion wasn't a term back then, but certainly that if it was, that would have been the topic of our workshop in terms of how do you value differences. We're sitting here among U.S. citizens, U.S. military spouses and families, the State Department, East and West Germans who don't get along yet. How do we learn to have a conversation that makes all these intersections work? And during the program, a young soldier raised his hand to share what he was thinking, and he, deeply emotionally touched and in a lot of pain, said, I'm just so tired of being trained to hate. And I was stunned. First, I thought, how did something we did up here on the stage provoke you to think that? But more importantly, I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand, well, what do you mean? And what are you going to do? And, after the program was over, I went out into Munich to a beer with him. I was so fascinated by his story. And I think that, for me, in hindsight, I don't fully know that I appreciated it at the moment, James, but I think I realized that telling great stories was not going to sustain me for 40 more years, but engaging other people's stories was far more fascinating to me and gave me life and gave me joy. And I think that was a pivotal moment for me to begin shifting my career to someone who enters the stories of other people to help them shape those stories in ways they want, rather than simply telling great stories to people who are there to, observe and consume them.
So that's an example there of a country going through a transformational change. So what you do now is you work primarily with organizations and senior leaders in organizations when their organizations are going through that kind of transformational change as well. Is it just me, or it just feels like everything is speeding up? The pace of change is feeling faster than ever now.
I think that's very true. I think whether we're working at the country level, which we do sometimes, or the organizational level or the community level, I think part of what's breaking down is the paradigm of change as an episodic event. You go from incrementally predictable changes to discontinuity in a industry or in a field, and then you put the seatbelt on for disruptive change. I think the reality is that disruptive change, adaptive change, is now a way of life. So it's no longer change management isn't something you apply to a season of turbulence. It's a sort of a uniform you wear to work every day. And I think we haven't prepared people for that. I mean, as human beings, we're homeostasis-seeking machines, right? We want comfort, we want predictability, we don't like change. I think the only people who actually like change are wet babies. But other than that, even change we choose, we complain about, right? And so we don't like taking routines that we have grooved very well and predictable ways of how we live our lives and upending them. And the fact that things keep coming at us to do that, technology, new products, even if you look at the how people consume smartphones and they can't wait for the next upgrade, they still bitch about that because they have to move all the apps. Yeah. Right. So what are the companies doing? They're trying to make change management easier by, like now Samsung, you can buy a new version and it all moves for you.
So I heard an interview that you did recently where you said a great quote. I think it's something that you've said. It's not a quote from someone else, and said, "Until you tell me what you're willing to say no to, you have no strategy." So how do you help entrepreneurs and executives get clear on this strategy when it feels like this disruptive change is that's going to be there all the time? What is the role of strategy when you have artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, robots, which are just like tectonic plates that are moving all the time?
It's a great question, James. It makes the discipline of strategy all that much more important. To keep your eye on a horizon, to keep your eye externally grounded is that much more critical. And so many leaders start with the fundamental assumption of not really knowing what strategy is. It's so common when I ask for a leader to tell me their strategy, they'll give me their strategic plan. They'll give me the goals for the year. They'll give me the mission statement. They'll give me product quotas. They'll give me some financial metric or some customer segmentation thing. But they don't answer the question of fundamentally, who are you to the marketplace? Where do you create value? Why would people choose you over somebody else? What are you better at than anybody else that gives them a reason to choose you? And why would they pay you for it? And who are you saying no to? Who will you not serve? And too often, the sales force is defining the strategy because they're out there getting revenue and being rewarded for getting revenue from wherever they can. So whatever they're selling, Costco called, that's the strategy, right? So
is what some people might call an adaptive strategy then, or a bridge strategy perhaps.
Well, it's sort of the impulsive opportunistic strategy, right? They call it opportunism. It's really impulsivity. It's just really reactionary, quarter to quarter addictions to meet a certain number, and it's actually this very dangerous dilution of your identity.
But that must be very difficult for I know you work with Fortune 100 kind of companies as well, when they're getting those quarter by quarter, and investors are looking for is this CEO, is this leadership team getting onto this new trend that's happening here? Are they moving on to this? They're always kind of thinking about that. That must be a huge amount of pressure on those executives to break shiny thing syndrome. Especially,
James, to know that not every sexy shiny object is to be pursued, right? So, I'm sure board members are saying, hey, what does AI mean for us? Or, hey, what does this technology mean for us? Or how do we Uberize ourselves? And the reality is some of those are questions that are relevant to some companies, but not all of them are relevant to everybody. And so a great CEO that has a great handle on the markets he serves, on the customers he serves, on the technology disruptions that truly are relevant to their business, that's the CEO that's going to be able to weather those questions. I think the bigger danger often becomes the denial, right? That doesn't apply to us. And so, if you ask an emergency room set of doctors or a set of healthcare executives, do you believe in driverless cars? Do you believe that driverless cars are real? Most of them will say, no, that's years away. That yes, they're testing them, but But if you said, do you believe in semi-autonomous cars? Do you believe? Well, what do you mean by that? Well, like self-braking cars. Well, we have that now. I said, do you know what the next wave of semi-autonomous cars are? They're now going to be able to detect lane changes and stop you from changing lanes. It won't just be that your seatbelt buzzes or your seat vibrates or you get a beep. The car literally won't be able to change lanes. Well, that if in your ER that 80% of the car accidents that come into your ER are blind spot accidents, what is the implication for your revenue plan? If 80% of what funds your revenue plan in the ER goes away.
Isn't it you on that? Just the challenges now the executives have in terms of really understanding what to say no to, developing that strategy. You wrote a great article in Harvard Business Review where you talked about this 10-year study that you've done. I think the title was "What Great Executives Know and Do," and you picked up a couple of things there. One is they know their whole business, their entire business. They know how to, the different shape of their business, what's kind of going on there. They obviously have a deep knowledge of their industry. They understand their industry. They have deep relationships. But one of the ones I thought was really critical, the great decision makers. That word, decision in Latin, to cut. To cut those things out. Which is going back to that saying no.
Yeah. And by contrast, and we actually named the dimension choice because choice means to choose between, right? And most leaders don't want to make trade-offs. They deal out way too many yeses because they don't want to disappoint people, and they can't focus the resources of their organization. The leaders in our study that were exemplary were able to focus the resources of their organization on a few commitments they knew they could succeed at and say no to everything else. Leadership is the ability to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb. And most leaders don't want to face that reality. And so They become false consensus makers. They try and over-include lots of people. Or they become cowboys. They make all the choices themselves. And great choice makers blend the right data, the right intuition, and the right voices of other people into the mix to construct great choices. You're right. The word decide literally comes from the same Latin derivative as suicide or homicide. It means to kill off options. But too many leaders, they make decisions by default, right? And then so whatever they're left with, that's what they pick, rather than choosing from among trade-offs and saying, I will say yes to this great idea and I will say no to these great ideas. So that my yes to this idea can prevail.
So I'm guessing you've got this new book coming out. This book that's out just now as well, and I'm guessing even at the micro level, making decisions, all those little micro decisions you're making about what to not have in the book, what to exclude, what to cut from the book as well must be very difficult. I read something. I think it was you talking about on one of your books. Just the process of deciding about the title and the cover was kind of a major deal. Can you talk about that experience?
Well, so you know when you asked before about book writing and the maddening part of it, the commercial process of going to market. And if you're working with a commercial publisher, you don't really get the final say in the cover and the title. If you're working with a co-invested publisher, you get a say. And I remember, I'm not sure which interview you're listening to, but it was my book called Leadership Divided. It was a few years back. And I didn't get a say. And the publisher, we had agreed on a parameter, we agreed on a topic. And in the 11th hour, the editor just whimsically chose a title and a cover that was offensive, that was not relevant to what the book was really about. And it was a horrible experience. And in hindsight, I realized I should have fought harder for that. I mean, in terms of my own failure, learning to fight for what you believe in. When someone's going to hijack your own voice in some way, you have to put a stake in the ground. And I didn't. I was naive and I was anxious, and I didn't have enough. I didn't realize the implications of giving up that voice to a man who got fired 2 weeks later.
And how did you use that? Did you use that in terms of like the next book that you brought out? You wanted to have, you maybe published it in a different way, or you just ensure that like those conversations were happening right up front, so there was no ambiguity?
Both of those things, James. I definitely changed my publishing relationships, and I definitely was much more insistent in the future about those. What say I would or wouldn't have in those things. And that was just an unfortunate moment where, a book that I really cared a lot about, because it was about, it was before millennials were really a major topic of conversation. It was the early look at generational differences in the workplace and how to really forge a relationship between emerging and incumbent leaders. And I had a lot of passion for how that topic was being treated or mistreated. And so to have this very offensive cover and this very negative title was just hard, So for subsequent titles, I was much more militant about market testing and reader testing and design testing and making sure that we chose something that was relevant and fresh and compelling. I mean, the reality is, books are sold 80% on their cover and their title. It's so it does matter.
So I know that it's something that you're quite passionate about, and obviously in all the work you've done is this level of detail in terms of going into the interviews that you do, and the studies, the research that kind of goes into each of the books that you do. Maybe can you talk to us about any aha moments, maybe from this latest book, From Rising to Power, when you kind of went, oh wow, okay, that's a realization. You started connecting the dots or seeing certain patterns that appear to you.
Yeah, we had tons of data, right? We had 2,700 interview data. We had reams and reams of analytical data. We got to use IBM Watson, the AI tool, which was both fascinating and, I have to say, a little bit creepy to see how it works.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is reading the information, right? So and it's interpreting it. It's not just doing like content word recognition. It really is intuiting the content. And so I remember it was a Christmas holiday. My family was all home for the holidays, kids home from college. and we were sitting in the living room watching a movie, all wrapped in blankets, and I had piles of paper around me. And it had been the book had a rough go. We had to set it aside for months to do other client work or health issues, and so it really had a bumpy, almost not making it to the finish line kind of reality. And we're in the middle of Heartbreak Hill here, headed to the top, and I'm sitting there immersed in all this paper, looking at all these data points to see. And the part of the problem was these 4 recurring patterns you mentioned in that article repeated themselves over and over and over again that separated out the failures from the exemplars. The problem was, even after 99 regression analyses, my research team was like, enough, it's not going to change. To say that you had to be good at all 4 of these or you risk failure, well, I resisted it. I didn't want to say that. I didn't want to, because it felt like, well, who's going to want to do that? I wanted to say, well, you could be good at 3 and, learn 1, but that just wasn't true. So
is that because you then felt that maybe the reader would feel it was just out of touch to be able to get to that level? Are you just going to admit it too far?
It would feel unrealistic. It would feel, how can I be, and especially if you've waited too long, right? If you waited to cultivate these things, any one of which sounds overwhelming and powerful, now I've gotten my first senior role, and now you're telling me that I have to become good at things I've never become good at before. So I had accepted the fact that we're going to have to say this. We're going to have to say these are the 4 that set you apart. As I dug back into the exemplars, the thing that was refreshing to me to discover was not just naming those 4 patterns and trying to name them in an elegant, accessible way, but was to realize that they didn't come to be because of some magical pixie dust or some mysterious force they were born with. They all learned them, right? They all did the work to develop them, and they were learnable. And so being able to say, you can learn, all of us can learn these. We can become better at them. We can do things early enough in our careers. Organizations can do things for aspiring leaders or leaders they're trying to cultivate to prepare them for these things. We don't have to leave it to chance. And I think that was just marinating in the data and accepting that that's what the data said, and then accepting that I have to tell the readers the truth, but I can tell them a good truth by saying, start earlier, prepare yourself for these things, and when you get to your first senior role, you won't be tap dancing in the landmines.
So I'm guessing there, because you used the AI as IBM Watson for the kind of the deep dive, the on that kind of research stage and kind of going through all that data, that can also be turned around the other way to be a diagnostics tool. So people could, executives, leaders can be doing things, and it's analyzing, are they exhibiting these traits? Okay, we're seeing here that they're maybe not making they're not strong decision makers. Maybe that needs to be changed. Or their relationships seem very narrow, very kind of small. They're not deep levels of relationships. We need to improve upon that. Is that something that as a consultant, you kind of see opportunities maybe there on the diagnostic side, and then to help clients with that?
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, there are some diagnostic tools in the book that will help readers determine how, against these 4 patterns, where are they vulnerable. The great thing is that all of the 2,700 interviews were done as diagnostic interviews. They weren't done as research interviews. So they were already applied, people looking at their own context in their own organizations. So we had 2,700 diagnostic looks at leaders and their organizations. So we still have this huge pile of data. And now the 10 years of data is now 15 years of data about organizations. So we isolated in that data set the individual leadership behaviors and the connection of leadership on performance. Now we have all these other systemic factors around strategy and culture and work process and governance that we now get to go back and look again and have the AI read again to see what can we learn about the organizations themselves beyond just the leadership influence to what sets great ones apart from the also-rans.
So what did you, in terms of you work with so many different types of organizations at so many different kind of levels as well, and across industries, across countries and cultures, is there a particular stage of a business or an organization or even an executive that you really enjoy working with most? Maybe that just initial MVP stage, or when they make it Series A or Series B, or maybe they're going through some huge transformation in their industry, or they're just kind of coasting and they need to take is it from your perspective as a As a consultant, as a change agent there, is there one of these stages that you enjoy working with most?
Well, certainly any stage that's proactively pursued, right? So I think it's more archetype. So I think a couple of years ago, one of my painful epiphanies was, I really don't want to work with sociopaths anymore. I don't want to.
So once you took out 80% of the
right.
CEOs,
it definitely narrowed the market quite a bit. I want to work with, I can, of course, all leaders have some flaw in them, but I want to work with good-hearted, good-minded women and men who really care about their people and their organizations and their products and their marketplaces and want to get better. I don't want to work, on that continuum of disaster to platinum star. I want to work more toward the pretty good or really good to really great and awesome journey. I don't want to go from in a ditch and moron to marginally mediocre.
Yeah.
But that said, I think, one of the things that I love about the emerging mid-cap world is it used to be a mysterious, nebulous world of organizations, and we didn't know quite what they were. We knew they weren't startups anymore, but they weren't a Fortune 500 or a Fortune 1000 yet. But these are great companies that employ thousands of people. And I think when I enter those worlds, you see good-hearted people who have bootstrapped their way up. Maybe they're $100 or $200 million in revenue. Maybe they're $300 million in revenue. But they're often stuck in the bodies of $40 million organizations. And they grew, but they didn't scale. And now they're a little bit sideways, but they care. And what's so fun about those moments is to show them you can catch up. You don't have to have this thing go in a ditch. It won't be easy, but the journey to get your organizational body to match, it's like seeing the teenage boy and is standing there in his dad's suit, right? Yeah. You can grow into this, and here's how you do that. And to watch them want to dig deep for the courage to take that on and help their organizations go through the protracted and delayed maturity that they've avoided to a scalable growth enterprise. It's such an inspiring journey to watch because of the size of their enterprise. You can see the more immediate. It's not like there's 80,000 people around the world and you're going to have to see multiple years of horizons for change to cascade. This is 8 or 10,000 people, and you're going to see pretty quickly the impact of your leaders' work and your work. So that's often
they're not quite an ocean liner. They're more like a bit more like a yacht or something. They're slightly easier to maneuver and to move around.
Well, and often, James, they're just so much more willing. They haven't had the hubris develop of a very large company that's had such market success that's reinforced, right? I mean, success is the greatest impediment to change. And so, leaders in much bigger global enterprises have often clung to their successes and clung to their paradigms and very flawed assumptions. And so dislodging their mental models that have largely caused them to get into the ditch they're in and get them to suspend disbelief long enough to do a diagnostic to show them where they've missed a turn along the way, or they need to go back and do some things. It just takes longer. And so we're glad to do that work, and when leaders are wanting to do it, we're happy to partner with them. But in the mid-cap world, which is a much more sophisticated world, because those are the future Fortune 500 companies, their leaders, they used to never be open to help. They were self-sufficient, reliant, bootstrapping. We got this. We don't need any stinking consultants' help. To now, they realize that they're not as resource rich as big companies. They can't bring onto their staff strategy heads or HR or talent heads. And so there is a reason for them to have external partners to help them in their businesses and to help them grow and stabilize their journeys. And so they're usually more humble and usually more down to earth and approachable. So I'm finding a very refreshing kind of leader and a refreshing kind of organization in that world.
Fascinating. So the book's out, it's an Amazon #1, Rising to Power. But do you have an online resource or a tool or an app like Evernote or something you just think you could live without? You found really useful in the stages of kind of creating this book as well, maybe the research stage or the writing stage.
We have a program it's called Symphony, and it's our coding software. So it's not really, it's got some AI elements to it, but it's how we code data. So it really helps keep us honest. It really helps keep us focused on seeing patterns in our data. It's a powerful qualitative research tool, and it really is a it's how we enter. It's a sort of our MRI for organizations, and it's a wonderful tool.
Awesome. And if you could recommend just one book and one record to our listeners, what would they be?
So one would be David White's book, Crossing the Unknown Sea. It's he hails from your side of the pond, although he lives over here on my side of the pond. But he's a brilliant author and poet. But this book was more about the pilgrimage of work and our relationship to our work and our life and how we show up in the world. And I think it should be required reading for the whole planet.
Awesome. And what would the album be? Is there one album that you love, you play more often?
There's a scrappy little band here called Sidewalk Prophets, and they write beautifully inspired music, I think. And their album called Live Like That is a wonderful clarion call to live life to the fullest, to live with reckless abandon, to leave it all out there on the table and give it all you got. Awesome. So for me, it's an anthem.
Awesome. And we'll put these on the show and people go to jamestaylor.me and just look for Ron Carucci. You're going to find the links to all of these that we've been talking about today. So a final question for you, Ron. Let's imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you had to start from scratch. So you've got all the tools of your trade, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. You have to restart. What would you do? How would you restart?
I think I'd start by taking a fresh look at if I assume I was going to stay in the field of organizations and leaders, I think I'd take a fresh start at how could I isolate cohorts of leaders? How could I isolate the future CEOs of the world, the people who in 10 years from now were going to be tomorrow's great executives and tomorrow's great company heads, and figure out how to gather them into a cohort, virtually or otherwise, and accompany them for the next 10 years. Whether it was we were predicting well or not, how could we prepare them really thoughtfully, really intentionally, and creatively, so that there was no guesswork, there was no high levels of risk standing before them for their families and their careers and those they led. So I'd love to begin a journey with those leaders of tomorrow.
And finally, what's the best way for people to connect with you if people want to learn more about your work as a consultant, but also the books as well? Where should they be heading to?
Yeah, come and visit us at www.navalent.com. We've got all kinds of fun, free articles, white papers. We'd love to give you our free quarterly magazine we publish on all kinds of issues of leadership and organization. If you come to navalent.com/transformation, we've got a free ebook for you, our look at how we lead transformation in organizations and what we think it takes. So free resource there for you as well. There's also a couple of pages on the research for Rising to Power and some buttons on where to get it. You can follow me at Twitter on @Ron Carucci, Carucci. Also find me on LinkedIn as well. Love to stay in the conversation with you.
Well, Ron, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Rising to Power is out now. I wish you all the best with it, and I look forward to seeing some of the leaders at your work with kind of rising and rising. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Ron.
James, great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.